Looking at our world from a theological perspective. This is the Theology Central Podcast, making theology central.
Good afternoon, everyone. It is Wednesday, June the 2nd, 2021. It is currently 3:21 p.m. Central Time, and I'm coming to you live from Victory Baptist Church, located right here in Ovalo, Texas, where we have been having a lot of rain and thunderstorms lately. The sky is growing kind of dark outside right now, and if you know anything, you know what that means. If we do get a storm here, there's a high probability I will lose power or internet. So I am hoping that does not happen, but I'm going to be here for the next few hours. I'm going to be here, I don't know, until sometime this evening, unless weather causes a problem. But I just noticed it's kind of getting dark out there. So I haven't looked, and I haven't looked at the radar, but I'm hoping everything is good. But even though there may be a storm building outside, I have a feeling a storm is about to be building on your side of this microphone, all right? Because there's going to be a lot of people who hear what I'm saying on this side of the microphone, and when they hear it, storm clouds are going to build on their side, and they're going to be very upset with me. And I'm hoping to avoid everyone being upset, because what I want to do is present a certain point of view and then challenge that point of view, or maybe try to add balance to that point of view and then try to see what you think. I'm more than willing to hear your point of view. I'm definitely willing to hear from you and have a discussion. I just hope that you don't misinterpret anything I say. Because look, if a storm forms because people have a correct understanding of what I'm saying, that's easier to handle. When storms form because people misunderstand what I'm saying, or don't bother to actually listen to everything that I actually said, that's when it gets very discouraging and frustrating. So please listen to me. Now, I think what's going to happen, I could be wrong here. I think men are going to have one perspective, women are going to have another perspective. And so therefore, I need the male members of the audience to speak up, and I need the female members of the audience to speak up, and I'm going to try to compare the different perspectives. And then what I'll try to do is after hopefully this sparks that discussion, hopefully this sparks ongoing discussion, and then I can bring all of that discussion together and try to say, okay, guys, here's what the women want us to understand. And then I can say, hey, ladies, here's what the men want you to understand. Because I think there's a very different perspective here. And I think the different perspectives can literally, I don't think people have a tendency to listen to one another. We speak past one another, and then people get their feelings hurt and get offended. And I think a lot of times we get offended because we're not listening. So we need to be very slow to speak here, slow to speak, quick to listen, right? And slow to wrath, all right? Please, slow to wrath. So there may be storms building outside here in West Texas right now. Let's try to keep the storms developing on your side of the microphone to a minimum. Are you ready? Okay, I've debated with myself, should I talk about this or not? But I feel that we need to. I really do. Okay, now here's what happened. I think it was yesterday. It may have been yesterday. I went to crosswalk.com, which I try to check maybe once a day just to see what's going on at crosswalk.com, because sometimes they have some interesting devotional articles. They have Christian news headlines. So I check it at least once a day just to kind of see what's going on. Crosswalk.com. And as I was scrolling down, I saw an interesting headline. And the headline reads like this. Are you ready? I want you to listen to it carefully. Women are not responsible for men's purity. Women are not responsible for men's purity. Now, I think there'll be many women who'll be like, amen, finally someone said it. because for too long, many women feel like that no matter what they do, they have to feel responsible if a man gets a lustful thought or if a man struggles, that somehow it's their fault and that they, have to, hide themselves, cover themselves, they have to do all these things because men cannot handle themselves. And if anything happens, the woman gets the blame and the man's seen to be the victim because the woman didn't do what she needed to do to protect the man. And there's many women who get very sick of that, very tired of that, and they want someone to speak up and say, you know what, I'm not responsible for your purity. On the other hand, I think some men may say, well, true, however, could you help us out? And then women are like, well, why should I have to help you out? You weak-minded man who can't control himself, it's your fault. And I think there's strong feelings on both sides, especially in 2021. And I think and I think part of the reason there's such strong feelings, I think there have been clear cases in history where a woman is either sexually assaulted, rape, something, or sexually harassed. And the woman whenever the woman expresses what has happened, it's almost like, well, what did you do? What were you wearing? Where were you? And it's almost like it's the woman's fault. Even though she's the victim, she gets blamed. And I think that has created a backlash, and maybe rightly so, that it created a backlash. But we have to look at this from a biblical theological perspective, and there's a lot to consider. So here's the frustration I have with crosswalk.com. I've already explained this to you before. Crosswalk.com has started putting their content behind a paywall. So now they'll write an article or a devotional and like, hey, if you want it, you've got to pay $4.99 a month, you got to subscribe. Well, I'm not paying to subscribe, but I'm just going to give you kind of their little tease that they offer for the article before you have to pay to read the rest. And we're going to use that to start our own conversation and our own discussion. All right. So that's what we're going to do. All right. So here we go. Women are not responsible for men's purity. This was published on June the 1st, 2021. So yesterday. It was put together by Crosswalk contributor Kelly Jane McGlynn, I guess is how you would say the last name. Kelly Jane McGlynn, a Crosswalk contributor. It is available on what they call Crosswalk Plus. And let's see, how much is Plus? Let me see. I'm going to click on Join Plus. It is, just so that you know, hang on, if it will load. It is, let's see, if you want ad-free, it's $29.99 a year. And if you want all access, so for ad-free, it's $29.99 a year. If you want Crosswalk Plus, it's $49.99 a year. And if you want all access, it's $74.99 a year. So if you want some Christian content, you got to pay $74.99 a year to get that Christian content. What a weird world that we are in, where now ministry is behind a paywall. It's just... well, we could have the discussion all day. All right. So here's their tease. All right. On March the 16th, 2021, a man named Robert Aaron Long killed 8 people at 3 different spas in Atlanta. When questioned about his motive, the statement was given by the police. He apparently has an issue, what he considers a sex addiction. And he sees these locations as something that allows him to go to these places. And it's a temptation for him that he wanted to eliminate. Now, if you want to read the rest of their content, to read their perspective, you have to join and pay. Now, first of all, let's just be honest. That's a very provocative way to start. Hey, you remember that man who went and killed all of those women at those spas? Well, he had a sex addiction, and he saw that these places were sources of temptation, and he had to eliminate them. Now, there's a lot of questions we have here. Okay, yes, maybe he had some very strong feelings about sex and temptation and addiction, but I think possibly we'd have to acknowledge there's been a lot of men for a very long time who have strong feelings about sexual addiction, temptation, trying to avoid it, staying away. They're frustrated, they're filled with shame, and they never bother to pick up a gun and go hurt anyone, and would never even consider picking up a gun and hurting a woman or killing a woman or making a woman suffer because of their struggle and addiction. So clearly this takes a situation to make their argument. Now, the actual substance of their argument, I do not have access to, and I'm not going to pay to get to, but we can take the idea and we can have a discussion amongst ourselves. So let's do that. Let's have a theological discussion about this subject, all right? So we'll summarize the subject. The subject comes down to this: purity, sexual temptation, lust, and sexual sin. Right? Let's just group all of that together. Purity, sexual temptation, sexual lust, and sin. Now, this is something that as Christians, we know the Bible tells us to keep ourselves pure, to keep ourselves from sexual sin, to avoid lust. The Bible makes it very clear that if a man looks at a woman with lust, he is guilty of committing adultery with her already in his heart. So he is to avoid that we are not to avoid in things that create lust. This would condemn, obviously, pornography. And this would condemn a number of, obviously, actual physical sexual sin with anybody. So these are things that, as Christians, we know that not only they preached against, that people who are Christians struggle with these things. And they struggle, and they struggle, and they struggle. And there's been a large backlash against a lot of Christianity's teaching about avoiding sexual sin, abstaining, staying away from it, because many believe that the purity culture, let's say of the 1990s, actually did great damage to people, hurt their marriages, hurt their understanding of sex, and actually was a very negative thing. So many react against any biblical teaching about sexual purity, abstaining, not looking at things for lust, and that they say those things are just outdated, they're harmful, they're foolish, and we should just ignore it. But we're going to operate from the perspective that no, the Bible says there is a correct way to deal with sexuality. There's a correct way to engage in it. There's a time that you can. There's times you must abstain, and you have to abstain from lust. And that's just, we're going to operate from the Bible being correct in that. Now, once we have that down, now here comes the question. How should we think? How should we proceed? And how can we avoid maybe some of the damaging errors that have occurred within Christianity over the years that have hurt marriages, maybe people's understanding of sexuality, maybe even their ability to have a healthy sexual relationship? How do we try to avoid some of this? Well, let's start with some basics, all right? Let's start with some basics. I know some of the things I'm going to say here may offend some people, but I'm going to do my very best, all right? So let's start with some basics. First and foremost, let's remind ourselves of this, that all lust, all sexual lust and desire for sex in an unbiblical way, it arises from within. The first issue, before we start asking, is it a woman's responsibility? Is it a man's whose responsibility? Let's always remember, first and foremost, it arises from our sinful nature that is inside of us. The desire for sex is obviously normal. It's a part of our makeup as human beings. It's a part of who we are. So the desire for it is right. Sex is not only it's okay, it's right. There's nothing wrong with it. There's nothing dirty about it. But that desire to have it and to engage in it maybe in a way that's not according to Scripture, that is a part of our sinful nature. Our sinful nature can take a good desire and then seek to fulfill that desire in an unbiblical way, in a way that is prohibited by Scripture. The desire is there. What we do with that desire, we have to then try to act upon that desire in a biblical way. Where our sinful nature gets in, our sinful nature kicks in, And our sinful nature just says, no, fulfill the desire. Don't abstain. Get what you want, when you want, how you want. Don't listen to any rules. Find pleasure. Find fulfillment. That's what you should do. That arises from inside of us. So in other words, we don't need an external anything. It starts inside of us. And that's what we always have to acknowledge and struggle with. It starts inside of us. That's the starting point. I've talked about this in our discussions on spiritual warfare. Spiritual warfare begins with fighting the battle that rages inside of you before you start worrying about raging a battle about anything outside of you. It starts inside, right? And we can talk about this in regards to mortifying the flesh, resisting, all the different things. So it starts right there. That's where we have to start. So before we start asking, are women responsible or who's responsible? We start with dealing with what's inside of us. And when it comes to sex, it's a natural desire that is right. It's what are we desiring? And are we desiring the right thing? And are we desiring it the right way, the wrong time? What are we going to do with that? All right. Now, there's so many different elements here, but I just want to kind of start with that basic point. Lust begins inside of us because the heart is desperately wicked. All right. So lust and sinful desires begin inside of us. We can't blame anybody else. It starts right there. That's an absolute important and a very critical starting point. That's number one. Number two. This one may be very controversial, but I want to hear this because now let's make this very clear. I'm speaking from the perspective of a man. And I know that women may have a completely different perspective, but sometimes all you ever seem to hear from a man is women seem to say, well, it's men. Well, men, they're the ones who are going to cheat. It's always men who cheat. It's men who have porn problems. It's always the men. Men, all they think about is sex. All they want is sex. Men have a sexual problem. It's always men's fault. It feels sometimes that men are just viewed as always being the problem with sex. Let's just make sure we establish a fact. For every man who's engaged in sexual sin, if he engaged in a physical act with a physical person, okay, now unless we're going to be referring to homosexuality, well, let's just state it this way. There's another person involved, right? Okay, now unless that man molested, assaulted, raped, if he didn't do that, then that means he engaged in a sexual relationship consensually with another person. So it's always like men are the ones who cheat. Now, if that man is cheating with someone who doesn't know that he's married, they have no idea that he's married, he kept that secret, he pretended to be single, and they were single, then you may have a point. But if the other person knew exactly what they were doing, well, put it this way, even if they knew he was single, they're engaging and they're not married from a biblical theological perspective. They're engaging in fornication. They're engaging in sex without being married. It still requires another person. So a lot of times it's like, all men, it's always men. It's always men. Men cheat. Men do this. Men do that. And it's like, well, yeah, but there's someone participating with them, right? So what about all the women who are participating in all of that sexual sin that men are engaging in? Are those women just absolution is just granted and they're not considered to be a part of the equation? It's just the man? Now, women may say, well, that's not fair. Men are the predators, predatory. Men are doing this. And you're saying the women are just incapable of making any kind of they're just like Play-Doh, and they can just be manipulated, and all you got to do is know the right words to say, and the next thing you know, you can just make, a woman do whatever you want because the woman is incapable. She's too emotional. She can't be rational, and she can just be manipulated. I just think sometimes we have to realize that, number one, lust begins inside of us, and number two, that in most cases, it takes two. It takes two. And let's make it very clear. It's not just men who look at pornography. There's plenty of women who do as well. It's not just men who lust. Women lust as well. Now, you could say that there may be a difference. Maybe a man is looking at explicit pornography where a woman is looking at and reading romance novels. That's a different kind of lust and a different kind of desire. All right, they still have their own issue. I just want to make it very clear that men and women are both sexual beings and both engage in sexual sin. It's not just men. And sometimes women will say it's all men think about. It's all men this, men that, men this, men that. It's always and it's like, well, the woman was present, the woman was there as well, right? So we've got to consider it that the problem of sexual sin requires two individuals. Even if it's a homosexual situation, it's still two individuals, not just one. Right? So I think that these are two very important facts. Number one, begins with lust inside of us. That's no one else's fault. That starts right there. Number two, sexual sin usually requires two people. And I think it is foolish for us to always just put the emphasis on it's men who struggle with this. It's men who struggle. Men are the ones who want sex. And I think that's sometimes, now we could start trying to pull up statistics, but human beings, male and female, are sexual beings. Now we can get into the differences or the similarities, but I think it's unfair. So it requires both, right? There's two. Now, number three. All right, this is very important. You cannot blame other people for your sexual sin. Period. No matter what's going on, no matter what's happening, you cannot blame other people. You can't blame the woman. You can't blame it. You've got to take responsibility for yourself. The woman can't blame the man. The man can't blame the woman. No, I think everyone has to take responsibility for themselves. Now, I'm not talking in regards to, obviously, if there's rape or there's sexual assault, then you should not take any of the blame. Obviously, I'm talking of sexual sin. That's a crime. That's a sin, but it's also a crime. I'm not talking about criminal activity. Please make sure, I've got to make that very clear. A woman who's been raped, sexually assaulted, or a child who's been molested, you should feel no blame at all. It's not your fault. You are the victim. But I'm talking in normal sexual sin, people have to take responsibility for their sin. And you can come up with all the excuses in the world. You can come up, the woman may say, well, my husband ignored me and wasn't emotionally close. And so I became vulnerable to another man's attention, and he showed me attention and he treated me and he listened to me. And then I became emotionally attached. The man can say, well, the wife, stopped being this way after all of these years of marriage. And, felt she wasn't doing everyone can blame somebody. Everyone can blame somebody. You can't do that. From a Christian perspective, you are responsible. You have to take that personal responsibility. So no one should blame anybody, all right? Men shouldn't be blaming women. Well, look at how they dress. Look at this. Look at that. Look at this. You've got to take responsibility for yourself. Now, the lust starts within you, and you've got to fight it, but you are responsible. You are responsible for your actions. All right. So I think it's very important. Number one, lust starts inside of us. Number two, it takes two. And we should view it that way and stop viewing that sexual sin as just a guy problem. There's two people involved. I'll never understand that. It'll be a woman will be upset because her boyfriend or her husband cheated. All men are cheaters. And who did he cheat with? Wasn't there another person involved in that? Right? For him to cheat, it required someone else to be there. Yes? Now, did that person know he was married? If they did, then they willingly chose to get involved in a relationship with someone who is married. They're not responsible? Why don't you say all women are cheaters? Right? I mean, because it takes... Now, if the woman had no clue, no idea, that's a whole different perspective. But then again, she would be engaged in premarital sex. Now, again, from a Christian perspective, that it's just sometimes I think we sometimes state that in such an incorrect manner that it requires two. And then number three, each person has to accept responsibility for their failure. You can't blame anybody else. You can't say, well, this person did this and this person did that. And maybe they did. Maybe they did. Maybe they knew that you were going to be in this situation at this time, and that you were going to be alone, and they contacted you and started saying this, and this. Maybe they did all of those things. Now, that person is responsible for their actions, but guess what? You made the choice to then continue to engage. You are responsible, and you can't blame anyone else. Now, I know you want to blame someone else because it makes you feel less responsible, but you got to accept responsibility. It's ugly, it's painful, but you got to accept responsibility. So number one, it starts inside. Number two, it takes two. However, you've got to accept responsibility. Now, here is the $1 million question. I want you to think about this. Now, I am not looking at this, if you're not a Christian, I'm not looking at it from a non-Christian perspective. I'm looking at it from a theological, biblical Christian perspective. So let me ask you a theological question here. What responsibility do you have in regards to other people and them sinning? Do we have any responsibility to one another? Does the Bible offer any discussion about our responsibility to one to another? Can you think of some scripture that would speak of what your responsibility is to other people? Does the Bible have anything to say about it? Because remember, the Crosswalk article, now again, we don't have their perspective. I understand we don't have their perspective because I'm not paying $74 a year to read it. But it says women are not responsible for men's purity. Now, the headline is very dogmatic. Women are not responsible. But I want to ask the question, how are women responsible for other people, and how are men responsible for other people? As Christians, do we have any responsibility for anybody else, or is it all just a dog-eat-dog world, and all we care about is ourselves, and I'm not responsible for anybody else, and I can do whatever I want, and whatever happens, happens? I would say the minute you start thinking that way, you may want to call a timeout. Now, they may clarify in the article. Let me make it very clear. They may clarify, but I'm just going to say that we need to think about this from a biblical perspective, all right? And the Bible has a lot to say about this kind of thing, and I will just take you to one very important example, and that is, 1 Corinthians chapter 8. Let's go to 1 Corinthians chapter 8. Now, this doesn't deal with sex, but it deals with a natural desire, and in this particular case, natural desire to eat food. All right? A natural desire. There's nothing wrong with desiring food. Nothing wrong with that. And the desire in itself. But is there a situation where you could eat and actually be hurting someone else? And if your eating hurts someone else, do you have any responsibility to them? Or you can say, you know what? Oh, this causes you problem? Well, watch me eat it anyway. What happens? Now, some of you know where I'm going with this. 1 Corinthians chapter 8. All right? 1 Corinthians chapter 8. Let's see, where do we want to go here? Let's just work through the chapter. It's only 13 verses, but I think this establishes a principle. I want to look at a lot of other scriptures, so the other ones I may have to just go through quickly, but let's at least take 1 Corinthians chapter 8 apart. So let's do a little background here, right? 1 Corinthians is a letter written to a church, and that church is located in a city. In this particular case, the city was influencing the church more than the church was influencing the city. All right. And the church had every kind of problem. They had sexual sin. They had pride. They were carnal, every kind of problem. And one of the issues that was happening within the church was an issue about eating meat. Because there was meat being offered unto an idol. Obviously, the idol doesn't do anything with the meat. And then at some point, that meat would then be taken and then sold in the marketplace. Maybe it was sold at a discount, but it was sold, and then people would buy it. Well, some Christians would eat that meat, and others would be like, well, how dare you? You're eating meat offered unto an idol. You're an idolater. How dare you do that? And others were like, the idol is nothing. It's not causing any problem. Get over yourself. All right. So does anyone have any responsibility to the other side? Who has a is it because wait, I'm not responsible for you, or am I responsible? Are we responsible for one another in some way, shape, or form? Now, let's see what they have to say here. 1 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 1. Now, as touching things offered unto idols, we know that we all have knowledge. Knowledge puffeth up, but charity edifieth. We all have knowledge, but knowledge can make us arrogant, but love edifieth. Okay, so there's this principle of love being mentioned, which is going to be the center of 1 Corinthians, right? One of the main things the church needed to know is what true love looked like. And true love definitely means looking out for someone else other than yourself, which seems to be a biblical principle. But let's continue. If any man thinketh that he knoweth anything, he knoweth nothing yet as he ought to know. But if any man love God, the same is known of him. Now, verse 4. As concerning, I'm trying to hold this close to the microphone. As concerning, therefore, the eating of those things that are offered in sacrifice unto idols, we know that an idol is nothing in the world, and that there is none other God but one. Now, please, there's the knowledge. Remember, he says, now, we all have knowledge. There's the knowledge. We all know that an idol is nothing. There's only one true God. For though there be that are called gods, whether in heaven or in earth, as there be gods many and lords many. But to us there is but one God, the Father of whom are all things, and we in him, and one Lord Jesus Christ, by whom are all things, and we by him. Howbeit, there is not in every man that knowledge, for some with conscience of the idol unto this hour eat it, as a thing offered unto an idol, and their conscience being weak is defiled. Some people, they see that and their conscience is defiled. It's going to cause them problem. Wait, that's idolatry. Wait, that meat was offered unto an idol. It's idolatry. Their conscience is going to be defiled, and it's going to create problems. Now, could you say, but I'm not responsible for your conscience. I'm not responsible about your conscience purity. It's not my problem. Or is it? Let's see what the suggestion is here. Verse 8, 1 Corinthians 8:8. But meat commendeth us not to God, for neither if we eat are we the better, neither if we eat not are we the worse. So he says, now wait a minute, guys, look, eating meat, what is eating meat? Meat doesn't bring us closer to God or keep us further from God. It's just eating meat. So don't make it the most important thing in the world. But take heed, look at verse 9, 1 Corinthians 8:9. But take heed lest by any means this liberty of yours becomes a stumbling block to them that are weak. You may have the liberty to eat meat. It may be perfectly okay for you to eat meat, but you can't do that if it's going to cause someone else to stumble. And someone, but wait a minute. Why? It's not my problem. I'm not responsible for you. But are you from a biblical perspective? Verse 10, for if any man see thee, which hast knowledge, sit at meat in the idol's temple, shall not the conscience of him which is weak be emboldened to eat those things which are offered to idols? And through thy knowledge shall the weak brother perish for whom Christ died? Could you not ultimately hurt someone? But when ye sin, so against the brethren and wound their weak conscience, you sin against Christ. Hey, when you hurt them, you sin against Christ. Wherefore, if meat make my brother to offend, I will eat no flesh while the world standeth, lest I make my brother to offend. What's the solution? If eating it's going to cause someone to be offended, it's going to defile their conscience, it's going to hurt them, I'm going to abstain, even though I have the liberty not to abstain. I'm not going to do it in front of them. I'm not going to do it around them because I'm not going to hurt them. Now that seems to go against at least the headline for that article. Women are not responsible for men's purity. Well, then Paul could have told the church at Corinth, you're not responsible for anyone else's conscience. You're not responsible to protect their conscience from being defiled. It's not your problem. It's their problem. Christianity seems to always say, no, love means placing other people before yourself. And this means going so far out of your way to even abstain from eating meat if it was to offend someone. Now, no one really practices this in any meaningful way, but it would be like if you have people in your church. Now, our church doesn't have, church organized potlucks and fellowships. We don't do that kind of thing because if people want to eat together, they can plan it. But I just want to see, and you can try this at your church. There's someone in your church who's a vegetarian or a vegan, and they are greatly offended. They think it's wrong for people to eat meat. The next time you have a church potluck or fellowship, make it a vegan one or a vegetarian one so not to offend the vegan or the vegetarian. See how well everyone in the church goes along with that idea. They'll be like, what? They can get over it. It's perfectly okay for me to eat meat. How dare they? Well, wait, they're offended by it. Their conscience, don't you care about them? No, I can't, because I'm going to eat what I want to eat. But what is meat? What is eating meat? It doesn't make you any more godly. It doesn't draw you any closer. So why wouldn't you just give it up? Oh, you ask people to do that, people will no, because everyone they don't want to take any responsibility for anyone else. Is, in a way, an article saying, hey, women are not responsible for men's purity? I'm not saying that it's the intent, but in a way, is it kind of denying this biblical teaching that maybe we do have some responsibility to other people? Even if it means sacrificing our own liberty? I'm just going to go through some other scriptures that would carry the same idea. You find the same concept in the book of Romans, chapter 14. The book of Romans, chapter 14. Right? The book of Romans, chapter 14, verse 13. Let us not therefore judge one another anymore, but judge this rather, that no man put a stumbling block or an occasion to fall in his brother's way. Now, how do you get around that? Don't put an occasion for someone to fall. Don't put it in their way. You are responsible not to put anything in the way of anyone else that could cause them to stumble or fall. Now, what does that look like? What does that mean? How far does that go? Now, I understand women will say, well, you know what? I could come to church wearing a garbage bag and from head to toe, and that still wouldn't stop men because men are a bunch of disgusting pigs. Well, I understand that. But the issue isn't, are men disgusting pigs? The issue is, and listen, as men are responsible and they cannot blame the women, they should not be blaming the women. The woman has to look at herself. What is your responsibility before God and others? What can you do? What could you not do? What can you do to avoid causing someone to stumble? Now, this goes for a man towards a woman. This goes from a woman towards a man. This goes from a teenage boy to a teenage. It goes in every situation. And it's not just, I want to make this very clear, it's not just a sexual subject, but the article from Crosswalk is making it about purity. It can be about anything. Here it's used about in regards to eating meat in 1 Corinthians. You don't want to do that. And 1 Corinthians talks about not taking a lawsuit before the world. Don't take a fellow Christian to court, even if it causes you to be defrauded. You would rather be defrauded than bring an occasion to bring a lawsuit before the lost world because you could cause them to stumble. Once again, the idea is being defrauded, possibly so not to cause someone else to be hurt. To give up, in a sense, a right so someone else would not hurt. Do not put an occasion for anyone to fall. Where is the responsibility? What is the responsibility do you have for other people? Not causing them to sin. What is your responsibility? Now, I want you to think about this going beyond just sex. For example, social media. What is your responsibility when you post something that could create anger, or you jump on someone's timeline to start arguing, which could create anger? It could cause them to stumble and fall. Now, you're not responsible for their anger. No, they are responsible and they can't blame you. Well, I got upset and I'm mad and I said these words and I got upset and I used wrong language and because of what they did. No, you can't blame anybody else. You're responsible. But on the other hand, what is your responsibility? Not to cause someone a problem. What is your responsibility? Do we have any responsibility to anyone other than ourselves? All right. Luke chapter 17. Luke chapter 17. I'm going to look this one up in the King James. Luke chapter 17. Luke chapter 17. I've got like 50 scriptures here. I don't know. I don't even know the number. How many? Do I have a number? How many I have written down here? I have 100. I have 100 here that could possibly relate to this subject. I'm not saying all of them are perfect, and I'm not going to go through all 100. I'm just saying that the Bible has a lot to say in regards to this kind of subject. All right. Now, this one is interesting. Luke chapter 17, verse 1. Then saith he unto his disciples, this is Jesus speaking. Jesus is saying this to his disciples. It is impossible, but that offenses will come, but woe unto him through whom they come. It's impossible that offense is not going to come, but woe to the person from whom that offense comes. Another translation states it this way. And he said to his disciples, temptations to sin are sure to come, but woe to the one through whom they come. You don't want to be the source of temptation. Now, I'm not saying that denies the responsibility on the other person's part. You still have the responsibility, but don't you have a responsibility not to be the source of offense, the source of falling, the source of temptation? Jesus goes on to say in Luke chapter 17, verse 2, it were better for him that a milestone were hanged about his neck and cast into the sea, that he should offend one of these little ones. Take heed to yourselves. If thy brother trespass against thee, rebuke him, and if he repent, forgive him. But you don't want to be the one that causes someone to sin. You don't want to be the one that's causing someone to stumble. You don't want to be the one causing someone to fall. It seems to be a pretty biblical idea. All right. See here, I've got a bunch of other scriptures here. Romans 14:21 from the ESV. It is good not to eat meat or drink wine or do anything that causes your brother to stumble. It's good not even if you think you have the liberty to drink, you don't drink if it could cause someone else to stumble. You say, well, it's not my problem. I don't have an issue. You have a responsibility to other people. All right. And then I've got a lot of other scriptures here, but I'm not going to go through all of them. Some of them are very applicable. Some of them are kind of questionable. I'm going to stop right there, and I'm going to ask you, and this is what I would challenge you to do. Try to come up with 10 scriptures. Try to come up with 10 that you think indicate your responsibility in regards to other people and trying to keep them from sinning, not causing them to stumble, not causing them to fall. Try to find 10. And I will say that when we get into this discussion about who's responsible for whose purity, at least these 10 passages should come into play. I think, am I my brother's keeper? Yeah, I think you can probably find that scripture. I think the implication is, are we not our brother's keeper? Are we not responsible in some way, shape, or form? Now, I understand historically the way this gets played, the way this kind of gets presented. And I understand why this makes some women very upset. It kind of gets presented like, here are these men. They can't control their eyes. They can't control their thoughts. They can't control their hands. They can't control themselves. So the women have to cover up, stay out of the way, be careful, because, men cannot control themselves. And I understand that the way it's been handled and presented in many cases is wrong. In many cases, it makes women, now this is the problem men sometimes don't think about, it makes women feel bad about themselves. Makes them feel bad about maybe their bodies, their looks. They feel bad about it, and say they feel like they have to cover it up, and they feel shame. They feel guilty because whatever they do, they're going to make a man fall into sin. And that is problematic as well, because a woman should never feel bad for that and should have to feel shame for that. They shouldn't. But at the same time, what is their responsibility? And what is that? What does that responsibility look like? In other words, what can a man do in order not to cause anyone else to stumble? Men have responsibility too. What can a man do not to cause a woman to stumble? And what can a woman do not to cause a man to stumble? We're in this together. I think this is very important and we have to consider. So we start off, number one, with realizing that lust and sinful desire starts inside of us. There's the real battle. It's a battle inside of us. We have to understand the desire, acknowledge the desire, and fight against it. We have to start right there. I think it's very important. Number two, we have to realize we are responsible and no one else is to blame. We are responsible. We cannot blame anyone else. If we stumble, if we fall, I don't care. You say, well, that person put the stumbling block right in front of me. Maybe they did, but it's of no value to put the blame on them. And you just say, I sinned. It was my fault. No one else is to blame. That's all you can do. Even though there may be 50 other parts to the situation. There may be so many different other elements that no one knows, no one will ever see. But you know what? Trying to tell anybody else, nobody cares. They think you're just making excuses anyway. So all you can do is just look at people in the eye and say, I did it, my fault, no one else to blame. I take full responsibility. And you can try to say, well, I did this, but however, they did this, and this. See, I'm not just accept responsibility. It doesn't accomplish anything. Just accept responsibility. But number three, what responsibility do we have towards other people? What responsibility do we have towards other people? What does the Bible seem to indicate? And it seems to indicate that we should go so far out of our way to even give up a liberty, to give up a freedom, give up something that we can do because it could cause someone to stumble. Even going so far as being ripped off and not taking someone to court because you don't want to cause someone to stumble, and not eating meat when you can clearly eat meat because you don't want to cause someone to stumble. The Bible seems to clearly say that we put others before ourselves. We give up our rights and our liberty and our freedom for the benefit of someone else spiritually. Now that's a radical thought. And then I think so those are three very important points. And I guess number four is, though, we do have to be very careful how we talk about this, because I think for many, and women will be the ones to try to clarify this, because I'm speaking from a male perspective. So women would have to come into play here. I think in many cases the church kind of puts it on, well, the man messed up, but what was the woman doing? The man messed up, but what was the woman wearing? The man messed up, but you know how women are. And that's not fair. That's not fair. But then sometimes people will say, well, it's a man. Well, of course he messed up because all men are sexual, deviants who can't control themselves. So of course the man messed up. Well, wait a minute now, slow down. Because for every man that messes up, well, usually he's messing up with a woman, just looking at it from a heterosexual perspective, right? If the man's messing up, he's messing up with a woman. So how come it's just the man and the woman somehow doesn't get counted in that? The scenario requires two, not just one. It's not like just men are out there just messing up with no other women, right? No, it requires women. In many cases, those women know exactly what they're doing. And sometimes we treat women like, they're just so weak and frail. They had no clue. They were so manipulated. They didn't know what was going on. I mean, that man played that woman, like a musical instrument. She didn't have and come on now. Come on. Now, either we view women as so weak and so pathetic, or women are very capable of knowing what they're doing as well, and they are responsible as well. Now, the man can't blame the woman, but I don't think the woman should be turning around blaming the man. Everybody takes responsibility, but I think we have to be very careful, though, that we don't make the women, and I will say this, because I think I've seen it sometimes that the woman is blamed. Well, look what she was wearing. Well, what do you expect? No. That's not. First of all, that is absolutely just horrific that we ever say that in regards to sexual assault. Whenever someone says, well, he sexually assaulted the woman. Well, why was she there at 2 a.m.? Well, the woman can be there at 2 a.m., 3 a.m., 4 a.m. No means no. Okay, and boys need to be taught that. All right, boys need to be taught no means no. That means keep your hands off. There's no force there. There's no excusing of that. If a woman is walking down the street not wearing any clothes, that gives no man a right to touch or to do anything. It doesn't, because no means no. You can't touch. It's not your body. It's someone else's body. So I think that we've got to balance that out. Now, obviously, you could also then balance the other way and go, but at the same time, it's smart to make wise decisions, right? Let's just remove sex from it. If I'm told that there's a very dangerous part of town where there's a high crime rate, I probably should not pull up in the middle of that bad neighborhood at 2 a.m. walking down the street carrying bags of money because I could possibly put myself at risk. Now, that doesn't mean anyone should rob me. By no means. They're wrong. It's not my fault. It's not my fault. I shouldn't be robbed. I should be able to walk down the street carrying, $1 million, flashing it around, and nobody should do anything because it's my $1 million, right? But at the same time, then there's wise decisions. So balancing it out. But sometimes when you try to talk about this, everyone gets upset and everyone says, oh, you're blaming. No, I'm just saying we've got to look at it from a lot of different perspectives. I do think so many times the women do get blamed, and that's not fair. And I think that that's not right. That's the case. And I understand that the woman sometimes feels like, man, what am I supposed to do here? I can't speak. Maybe I shouldn't put on makeup. Maybe I should not, do anything with my hair. Maybe I shouldn't buy a new outfit. I mean, what can I do? And that's not fair either. And it's hard to find. And I think the problem is it's a discussion nobody wants to have because it makes everyone feel uncomfortable. And I think sometimes Christian girls I'm trying to think of my words carefully here. I'm trying to think of my words carefully here. I'm sorry. I have a bottle of water here and it was in front of my face. I'm going to take a drink. I think sometimes, and I think it's probably not on purpose, I think sometimes girls raised in a Christian home are constantly told, you can't wear that because, that's going to create a problem. You can't do that. You can't do that. You can't, what are you wearing? You can't do this. You can't do that. You can't say. And it's so that I think we don't realize maybe what it's doing to them psychologically about their body, about being intimate as they move on, because they've been told to cover up, bad, that it's hard to just switch that off and go, well, now I'm married, and I think it can create problems. I think sometimes when we're trying to do the right thing, there's unintended consequences that can be bad. And I think that has to be considered as well. I think we have to consider how, the responsibility can't just be from the woman to the man. The men have responsibility as well. But what responsibility do we have for each other? Once you establish, well, we have responsibility. Now, how do you express that? How do you express the responsibility of the woman in such a way that you don't do long-term damage in regards to their understanding of sexuality or their own body? How do you not do long-term damage? And a lot of times the emphasis gets put on the woman's responsibility and not the men. And that's not fair either, right? Because everyone's responsible here. Everyone's responsible for one another. But there is an area of responsibility. So I'm just going to put that there. But I challenge you, I think I said 10 verses. Find 10 verses that speak about responsibility for others in regards to not causing someone to fall, not causing someone to stumble, trying to help someone. I mean, we not only do we have we have two responsibilities. I want you to consider this. You have a responsibility not to cause someone to stumble, and you have a responsibility to help restore someone who does. So sometimes people are like, well, I didn't cause that person to stumble or fall. And then when we see them laying there on the side of the road all broken, we're just like, they messed up. Let me go call everyone I know and tell them how they messed up. How about you stop, pick them up, dress up their wounds, put them on the back of your mule, take them to a hospital, pay for their care so that they can be restored back to a position of usefulness instead of just taking a picture on your phone, posting it on social media and letting everyone know that the person is a failure. Yeah, that's another issue here. We have a responsibility not to cause anyone to fall, And we do have a responsibility for one another that once they do, we're there to bind up their wounds, to restore them, to help them, to bring healing, not just to gossip, slander, and add some more knives into the back of the individual. It's a very important subject. I know it's a very sensitive one. And I don't know, I think I hear, is that thunder? I think I'm hearing thunder on your side of the microphone right now. I'm hearing thunder. It's like, it's building. It's probably like an F5 tornado or a massive hurricane. And it's about to unleash on me in my email inbox or on YouTube. Everybody's going to be like, what are you talking about? How dare you? And I think I'm trying to be very balanced here. Now, again, if you're not a Christian, let me make it very clear. For non-Christians, I'm not talking about in your situation. We're talking from a biblical, theological perspective as Christians. What is our responsibility one to another? Not to cause someone to stumble and fall. And in dealing with that, without doing long-term damage to someone, especially when it comes to purity, about their body and their understanding of intimacy. Because again, sometimes we don't think about what that long-term effect will be. We'll just like, you can't do that. That's wrong. Don't do that. And we don't even think about, well, I wonder, in their developing brain, how they're going to process that when they're 23. How are they going to process that? And I think then creates intimacy problems, which then perpetuates intimacy problems in the marriage, then creates another whole different issue, right? Intimacy problems in marriage then creates the desire is there, then it's not being fulfilled, which can create other problems. Again, nobody can blame anybody else. Everyone's responsible. But you see how this can just turn into more and more problems unless we're willing to stop and have a very important discussion about it. Now, men, you can give me your thoughts. Women, you can give me your thoughts. Everyone's probably going to be offended by all of this, but I think it's important. If you want to pay the money to read what Crosswalk had to say about this subject, feel free to read it. Don't copy it and send it to me because that would be a violation, but you can summarize their arguments to me. I'll be more than happy to consider their perspective. Maybe it's more balanced. It just seems like it's very, hey, women are not responsible. And hey, everyone, you hear about that guy who went and killed all of those women because of sexual temptation? Yeah, women, you're not responsible for men's purity. Okay, that just seems very provocative in the direction it's going. Maybe it's more thought out and more layers are added in the article, and maybe it's more balanced. But I just think we have to, it just seems very like, I'm not responsible for you. So back off. Don't tell me what to do. Well, wait a minute. What about the biblical responsibility not to cause someone to stumble or fall? Has to be considered. All right, you can email me all your thoughts and disagreements to newsif@yahoo.com, newsif@yahoo.com. All right, thanks for listening. God bless.